person, I know that, but let me talk to my toddler skeleton in peace, okay? Anyway, I got in there and turned on one of the spotlights, which is just enough light for me to get around, and headed back to Derek. I vented my grievances to him, and after a pause I said, "I'm sorry," and was cut off by a loud bang behind me. I did not stay to see what it was, did not turn around, and honestly, it sounded like one of those spotlights jamming into the concrete floors. I ran out of there as soon as I got my body past the threshold of the door, and I poked my upper body back in to slam the light switch back off. That was when I saw it. Illuminated by just the edge of the spotlight was a figure, just a little too tall, about 7 to 8 feet. He was in the corner that would have been behind me while I was sitting down, and as the light turned off, I could still see his faint outline. It was like what many people describe as a shadow man, but man, he was looking at me and I was terrified. I sprinted back to the painting room, grabbed my keys, and got the heck out of there. I left my jacket, my backpack, my MacBook. I mean, who cares, right? I just wanted out at that point. And it's been so long since I felt fear like that. I haven't told anyone what happened. I really don't want to. I felt sick sharing this, in fact. I want to get this exam over and done with and then just not ever think about that building until, well, January, when I have to go back. This happened last year between Christmas and New Year's Eve. I'm from the French Caribbean, so it's not unusual to go scuba diving during Christmas holidays. So my family and I, 25-year-old female, booked a few dives. They're really good scuba divers, way better than me. They passed a few scuba diving levels that also allowed them to participate in way more technical dives than I'm allowed to do. I enjoy scuba diving as well, and I'm able to do almost every casual dive, but I don't feel safe diving without an instructor yet. Even more if it's a dive with decompression stops required. If anyone isn't familiar with scuba diving though, here's a quick explanation. So, you can dive safely until a certain deep before the pressure becomes dangerous. If you dive below that point, which is roughly 20 meters or 65 feet, you have to do decompression stops during your ascent. It means that you have to stop while going back to the surface a certain time to let your body adapt itself to the pressure. If you ride up too quickly, you may catch decompression sickness, which can lead, in worst case scenario, to dying. Anyway, so we decided that what I could manage was a little private lesson with an instructor first, prior to more exciting dives with my family. The first day, my family was enjoying a dive on a technical spot that I wasn't feeling up to while I was alone with my instructor, and retrieving my old scuba diving reflexes. Everything went okay, and we were on a beautiful coral reef. There were many beginners on the boat, and I was by far the most experienced here. So, finally my instructor decided that he could manage me with another student, which was a true beginner, and after a small briefing with every safety rule and hand sign, which is the only way to communicate underwater, we began our descent. Everything came back to me pretty quickly, and I was enjoying myself, going back and forth to the instructor and the beginner diver. It was probably about 20 minutes, I would guess, that we were down there. Everything was perfect too, beside one thing. You see, it was a windy day and there was a really heavy swell that day. It's less of a problem underwater than it is for the surface swimmer, but the only thing is that it requires more physical effort to swim, and so my air bottle was emptying a little quicker than usual, which is pretty normal. So I signed to my instructor that I was running thin on air, and he nodded. But at this level, it was far from being critical or anything. It was at this moment, though, that I saw a young man swimming towards me. It wasn't the instructor nor any of the students. In fact, I'd never seen him before, but he was in full scuba diving gear, and we were the only dive boat on the spot, so I assumed that he was with us, and I just didn't pay attention to him on the boat. He was swimming fast towards us and then signed me that he was out of air. When an air failure happens in scuba diving, there's a very strict procedure. You have to help the person, no questions asked, because every second is vital. If you faint underwater, then you drown. On your gear, you have 2 breathing devices too. I'm not sure about the English words, but there's a main device and a spare device. So I handed the guy my spare breathing device, which means that we were both breathing on my gear, consuming twice as much air as I was consuming alone. I waited until the guy seemed calmed down and tried to hand sign to him to go see my instructor. But strangely, he nodded no and signed to me to start our ascent. I understand this procedure. I was a little low on air and above the decompression stop level, so the right thing to do was to go up to the surface before having an air failure, but I would have to tell my instructor first. The guy was very reluctant though, and it was strange because it would have taken us like 30 seconds to tell the instructor, and he would have started an ascent with us. During this time, I was sort of panicking as seeing my own air levels going down so quickly, and I saw that our instructor was staring at us quizzically and swimming towards us. It was at this moment that the guy let go of my spare air device and started swimming away, breathing again in his own breathing device. Well, I was totally lost and started my ascent with my instructor. But once at the surface, because of the tides, I was feeling dizzy and sort of nauseous, so my bizarre encounter wasn't the first thing that I debriefed. It was after I calmed down and the boat was driving towards the beach, well, without the strange guy, mind you, that I asked my instructor what happened. I don't know, maybe a guy who lost his group and needed some time to calm down or something? I replied with, okay, but why did he tell me that he was out of air? My instructor told me that I probably misunderstood his hand signing, that he was probably not telling me that he was having an air failure because he left breathing in his own device. But I'm certain that I saw him do the air failure sign, but okay, whatever. In any case, the next day I joined my family during my dive, and the instructor was different. It was a girl this time, Charlie. I've had time to think about that guy, and I was worried about him, so I told everything that happened to Charlie and asked her if she knew this guy, and if he was okay because I didn't see him going back to the surface. She asked me to describe him, which I did, and she told me, oh, that's Marvin. Don't worry about him. He's preparing himself to become a scuba diving instructor. Every time that he has a day off from the restaurant he's working here, he asks us to drive him on the coral reef for the morning and pick him up in the afternoons. I actually ate at his restaurant this noon and saw him, so don't worry. I was pretty relieved by that, to be honest, and told myself that it was just a big misunderstanding, probably just a sign comprehension issue or something. Anyway, the rest of the week went on without any incident. I was doing more and more technical dives, and everything went very smoothly. Charlie was a wonderful instructor, and I never saw Marvin again. That is, until the last dive. So, it was New Year's Eve. We planned the best dive on that day. It was on a shipwreck, and I felt trained enough to try it without any instructor, just my family and I. It was Charlie's day off. It was fairly deep for a beginner like me, like 30 meters at its down point, around 98 feet. My first day, male instructor was there and told us that he would be exploring the shipwreck too, so we would cross him and he would help me if he saw that I needed it. It was very comforting to know, in fact, and my family felt comforted too when I told them that. So we began our descent and started swimming around the shipwreck. We crossed our old instructor twice, but every time I signed him that everything was okay. And it was at that moment that, completely out of the blue, I saw Marvin swimming towards me again. At this moment, I was about 5 to 10 meters above my down point, still staying under my decompression stop level. I was a little surprised, to be honest, and even more surprised when he signed me again that he was out of air. I was mistrustful at this point, but if there were any chance that it would be true, I could not help him. So I handed him my spare breather. This time I had a lot of air left, so it wasn't a problem. He took it, started breathing in it, then took my arm. I reached to see his air level instrument, but he prevented me from seeing it. And then he signed for me to start an ascent with him. I immediately said no, I wasn't at my deepest when he reached me. I had been deeper at this time, but I had decompression stops to do, so I saw that my father saw us, but he quickly looked away, probably not understanding what was going on. I tapped at my diving computer, a device which calculates when and how long to decompress, to signify it to him. He shrugged, smiled, and then just started swimming up, still holding me. I was sort of paralyzed for a few seconds, and the thing that helped me react was that my diving computer was telling me to stop and decompress right now. I then understood, though, that I was now in pretty serious danger, that if I let him do what he wanted, I could die from the bends. I then started screaming, only to remember that no noise can be heard underwater. I started wriggling frantically as I saw my father and sister way below me, my diving computer alerting me more and more intensely. At that moment, my father saw us and he reacted. He swam very quickly towards us, and I managed to hit this guy as my dad grabbed my ankle and suddenly dragged me deeper, and the guy then quickly swam away. My dad dragged me deeper again, and then we waited for a very long decompression stop to ensure that I would be okay. Then we started heading towards the surface very slowly and cautiously, and on the surface, I just started crying frantically and went back to the boat. My father then told me that he thought Marvin was my instructor and that this is why he wasn't surprised at first. I then told my instructor everything that happened, who took it more seriously this time, and he told me to show him Marvin when we go up to the surface. The thing is, he never came. The next day, though, on New Year's, we went a last time to the scuba diving club because my little sister had a diploma to collect, and we saw Charlie. Still choked up, I told her what happened with Marvin, and then she stiffed. She told me that Marvin was at the restaurant yesterday for New Year's Eve, and that he hadn't gone scuba diving, which means that whoever this guy was, it wasn't Marvin. To this day, I still don't know who this guy was and what he wanted, and why he tried to kill me. Maybe twice. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give a big shout out to Canva for sponsoring this episode. So making content is an essential part of what I do to keep this show going, but it definitely hasn't always been a seamless creative process. Creating graphics for my YouTube channel to fixing issues with my thumbnails, I certainly have seen my fair share of technology when I opened a drawer too loud to grab my hidden smell of pines, especially in East Texas, and the campsite was beautiful, not to mention the lake. We did some kayaking and hiking, and the views really helped my mindset. It was awesome, but on the third morning, my friend got an emergency call and had to bail at the last second. I was a little bit upset, but it didn't necessarily mean I had to go home just because he did. So I decided to stick to the original plan and find a place to camp deep within the forest. After he left, I headed to the nearest forest information center and snagged a map. The map showed the nearby highways and the forest and whatnot. I scouted a couple of park roads and made my way towards them. After about maybe 5 miles out of town, I find a park road which is indicated by a numbered sign and is only a dirt road. I head down it and settle in for the adventure. The road wasn't very narrow, but it would have been a hassle to move 2 trucks around each other, which I didn't really encounter, thankfully. I kept the map on my lap and followed the road with my fingers while also checking the road ahead for potholes and stuff. Now, the woods got super dense around me and darker as I kept going, and it all kind of just enveloped my truck at one point. I don't know how many miles I travelled before I first came to another turnoff, but it was clear that I was really deep in the woods. I travelled to where one group of campsite was supposed to be, which was a small loop basically. I turned down and, to my surprise, was met with a couple of trucks and RVs, all occupants outside cleaning guns or dressing deer. Please don't come at me, I've never been hunting. It was hunting season, so I guess it wasn't that big of a surprise, but it was still very off-putting though, with the looks that I was receiving. So I made the loop and I just continued on. I drove a couple more miles and found another remote spot at the very corner of the woods. I pulled over and set up the tent and a fire and brought out the whiskey. I didn't have a great night and was just burning some letters, so I got a little bit more messed up than I would have cared to be. So I ate some food, put out the fire and headed into the tent to play the Switch and just wind down a bit. It didn't take me too long to fall asleep and I slept pretty hard that night. But I woke up at around 1 o'clock in the morning to the sound of footsteps circling my campsite. I'm a very avid camper, so I just assumed that it was a critter checking out the human who decided to chill in his pad without asking. So I started to drift off again when I heard a loud cough, and at that, I was instantly awake. I just kind of laid there listening, and the footsteps, they approached my truck. I had locked my truck, thankfully, but heard the obvious sign of someone trying to handle, then quietly shuffling over to the other side and trying the other handle. I had a spotlight that I brought with me, so I quietly unzipped the tent and pointed my light in the direction of the noise and shouted out. And I caught a brief glimpse of whoever it was in all camo sprint off into the woods with no light. Like, they took off, and although I had no plans on following them, I scanned the brush with my light and couldn't see anything. I turned off my light to see if I could see a phone light or a flashlight, but instead I heard a very loud crashing into the brush that just got quieter and further away. So, whoever this person was ran into the dark woods with no light and in all camo. Considering the map and the direction that he ran also didn't have any more roads or amenities, maybe he was on private property or something. I don't know, but I was very scared, obviously, so I collapsed my tent, put it in the bag, shoved it in my back seat, and drove the park roads like a bat out of hell that day. Once I got back to the main road, I drove for 4 hours back to my hometown, and I want to go back sometime, but this time definitely with friends and maybe even a gun too. But yeah, that was not a fun experience, and definitely up there with one of the most frightening things that has ever happened to me in the woods. So this happened when I was around 13 and it was summer, so that meant no more school. I would often spend my evenings with my cousin, who lived close by to me, and we would ride our bikes around the neighborhood until sunset. One day, it was the usual, but we happened to stop in front of a house and take a short break. As we're posted up just sort of talking, a middle-aged man approached us. He looked to be around maybe his 40s, tall and hairy with a big black mustache. He was wearing a grey sweatsuit with the hoodie over his hat. He looked like he just went out on a jog because he was super sweaty, but he approached us with a big grin. He then proceeded to ask for our names and what we were doing here. I quickly got the creepy gut feeling that something was off about this guy. I then realized that he was far more interested talking to my cousin in a flirty way. My cousin was only 13, just like me, but she looked a little older, although it was noticeable that she was still a minor. The creepy man kept asking questions, which I ignored because I found it odd. So my cousin kept answering his questions, and he then finally asked how old we were, and my cousin told him our age. I thought that he would finally get the memo after that and stop talking to us, but as soon as he heard our age range, he quickly had an eerie grin on his face and paused for a few seconds. He then mentioned that he has a niece our age and she would love to meet us and wants us all to become friends. He kept insisting that she would love us, and when we declined his offer, his tone changed and he started sort of gaslighting us. He kept saying that we'll make her cry if we don't go and that we're just mean girls for not going to meet her, etc. He keeps looking around our surroundings to see if anyone is nearby. He then starts offering us soda. He claims it's too hot to be outside and we should at least have a soda at his house. After saying no thank you, he keeps insisting he has all types of drinks available at home. This kept going on for a good 10 minutes as well, of him convincing us to go to his house, and We kept saying no thanks multiple times till he finally gave in and just left. He didn't say goodbye or anything, he just turned and stormed away all angry. We still lived in that area for a few more years before moving, and strangely enough, we never once saw this man ever again. Looking back at this situation, we were very vulnerable for 13 years old and would often get into trouble, and we could have easily went with him in his house to get free soda, and, well, who knows what could have happened then. And I mean, no grown man in their right mind keeps insisting that 13-year-olds should go into his house, right? It all started when I was 5 to 6 years old and had an imaginary friend called Bombo. He was a small Victorian boy who lived with his mother, who I said lived under the floorboards in the house that I grew up in. I used to talk and play with him all the time, teaching him about things like my Velcro shoes and some toys that I had. It was no secret to my family who Bombo was and even what he looked like, from how I had described him. One day though, my sister, 14 years old at the time, went back upstairs to our shared room after a family day out, and she saw him too, standing in the corner of the room staring at her exactly how I had described him, even down to the detail of the clothes. Well, a few years passed and I was now 10 or 11 years old. Our family had moved house a couple of times, and now I lived in a 3-story house in a village just outside of my hometown. I always had a weird feeling about that house too, from the moment that we moved in, but didn't think too much about it over the excitement of having my own room on the top floor with a skylight. After a few months, things started to get a bit strange though. Things disappearing, hearing footsteps on the middle floor landing at night, just weird stuff like that. These experiences progressively ended up getting stranger too, with sounds like nails being dragged up on the railings on the top floor getting worse and worse, as well as some nights my little sister, 3 at the time, screaming saying that there was a man growling at her in her room, although my family put this down to an overactive imagination and didn't really think anything else of it. It was quiet for a couple of months though before everything just came back again, but this time so much worse. This was also the first time that I saw it. So one night I was in my room watching TV and getting things ready for school the next day. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A face peering in at me through my skylight. Its skin was dark red and its eyes were like white with no pupils, only veins and dark circles around its eyes, leading to like black cracks across its face. It was grinning at me, and even without pupils, I knew that it had its eyes locked on me. Needless to say, after a few seconds of initial shock, I quickly ran downstairs to the rest of my family and refused to go back into my room. Shortly after this too, my older sister, who had given birth recently and was living with us temporarily, had her own experience as well. As she was sleeping one night, she heard a knock on her door at between 2 or 3 in the morning. Thinking that it was one of us knocking, she shouted "what?" twice with no response. But then, the door just flung open after a few seconds with so much force that the dresser had dented the door from the impact. She looked, but there was no one there. Shortly after that, we moved again for personal reasons to the house that we now have been in for years. For years, too, there was no unusual experiences other than the occasional sound of footsteps. Nothing that couldn't be logically explained, that is. When I was 18, though, my sleep schedule was the same as any teenager, waking up around noon and going to bed around 3 or 4 in the morning. And this one night in particular, I was up doing the same as always, listening to music, watching films, stuff like that. At midnight, or around that time, I went downstairs to the kitchen as usual to get some snacks, and on my way back up out of the kitchen, I saw it again. Standing behind the front door, looking in through one of the glass panels, was that same face that I saw all those years ago. Same red skin, same eyes, Same dark circles and cracking features. It was staring right at me too, and this time with one of its hands leant on the other glass panel as it watched me. The only difference, though, was that this time it wasn't grinning. After standing there for what felt like forever, I ran as fast as I could up to my room and locked myself inside. I didn't sleep a wink that night, too. Some family friends who were actually regular churchgoers theorized after they had heard what I saw that this thing that I had seen was actually Bombo, or what had taken the form as him in the first place, and when I had stopped giving him my attention and energy, he had then had to use another way of getting my attention. But I don't know what to think for sure, to be honest. All I know is that what I saw was the exact thing that I saw as a kid, and it came back. It's been 4 years since the last time that I saw it, and to be honest, I hope that I never see it again. What makes a murderer's mind tick? Killer Psyche is a true crime podcast from Wondery that explores these types of questions about the crimes that killers and criminals commit. Killer Psyche covers high-profile cases that have shocked the world. Host Candice DeLong uses her 5 decades of experience as a clinical psychiatrist nurse and FBI criminal profiler to dissect the motivations and behaviors of the most terrifying felons in history. You'll definitely want to listen to a recent episode of Killer Psyche where Candice explores the case of Pedro Rodriguez Filho, also known as Killer Petey, or the Brazilian Dexter. At age 14, Rodriguez murdered the deputy mayor in his town, all because the mayor had fired his father. Rodriguez went on to murder, by his count, more than 100 people, most of them while he was behind bars. To many, he was a hero, a vigilante seeking justice for victims, but to others, he was just a cold-blooded murderer. One of the highlights of the show for me personally was just how knowledgeable Candice is regarding all of the peripheral details to a case. It was a big granite outcrop in the middle of Victoria, southeastern Australia. There was a lookout at one outcrop, the lower one, that had a car park and a well-formed path to the top. And there was a dirt road that went for about 3 kilometres between that outcrop and the bigger, higher one. The dirt road curves around, but I used to like to walk through the bush between the 2 outcrops and climb the bigger one. These outcrops had a lot of huge granite boulders, some the size of a house even. You can climb some of them and jump from one to another like a big natural kids' playground almost. But anyway, we parked and walked up to the lookout. Nothing unusual. There wasn't anyone else around or any other cars, but this is not totally unusual for a weekday out there. We looked around at the surrounding countryside and after a few minutes walked back down the path and passed the cart across to the other outcrop. At that point, we both saw a man coming up the road, but he had 4 legs and 4 arms, it looked like. Not like they were naturally growing out of his torso, but like a video processing a glitch, where the 2 parts of the picture were doubled and sort of out of sync, one covering the other, about a third overlapping. It took a few seconds for us to actually work out what we were seeing, sort of like your brain trying to make sense of what you're looking at. I kept looking and trying to work out what was wrong with what I was seeing. I could tell by how my friend was acting too that he also saw something wrong. After maybe about probably 10 seconds, it felt a lot longer, we realized what we were seeing was actually what we were seeing. And at that, we both started walking really quickly the other way. We were headed back to the lookout, but the car was just 50 meters away. We started going back up the track again and then both stopped and thought, what are we doing? We need to just get back in the car, right? I could see the man getting closer, but he was still a ways off. We jumped in the car as quickly as we could, and I spun it around and got the heck out of there. Another weird thing about this guy, though, was that he was wearing a yellow tan top, maybe a jacket, and a turquoise pants. A really weird combination for where we lived. I didn't have to ask my friend, did you see that, because it was obvious that he had. And as we calmed down, we kept saying, what the heck was that? I don't know what that was, but man, I'm glad we got out of there. we eventually got to the next town and we bought some lunch and a drink, and we didn't talk about it to anyone or each other really ever again. However, now having heard some stories here, I often wonder if he saw exactly what I saw too, or if he saw something equally weird, but different. So I just want to say from the outset that I don't know if this guy was just mentally disturbed and kidding, or if he was actually malicious and just faked. So I was maybe 16 years old, and I was kind of a rebellious kid. I joined Tinder to meet some older guys, and I matched with this really attractive 20-year-old that seemed really into me. Naive, I know. But he asked to pick me up from school the following day to get ice cream and walk around a nearby lake, and I said yes. He picked me up, and we had a great conversation. Nothing really weird, and it seemed like we really enjoyed each other's company. But when we got to the lake, no one was there because it was the middle of October and cold on the water. But we walked about halfway around the lake, and that's when it got, well, weird. So he started talking to me about crime documentaries and how he'd studied them and knew how to kill someone without getting caught. He started making tracks in the mud and said that he would want to wear 2 big shoes so the police couldn't match.
All right, everyone, it's time for some fairly important economic news, which is that Evergrande in China has indeed defaulted. They had a temporary forgiveness that they had to go through while they tried to restructure things and see if they can take care of their debt payments. They have failed to make their latest debt payment. Now, this will not destroy the Chinese economy. This is a foreshock, but it's not the beginning of an avalanche. It's more like a little bit of rumble sometime before the avalanche. And it's an indeterminate period how long China can maintain its funny money, paper dragon style economy, but that's really what this is. The problem is that all of these companies essentially have speculated for years and years and years about growth that didn't happen. Exactly what happened in Venezuela. Now, Venezuela was, in many cases, a monoculture. You were buying against oil sales. So you're buying huge amounts borrowing huge amounts of money, with the idea that oil prices would continue rising. So Maduro and Chavez before him never cared. China's not a monoculture. They've got a much more diverse economy. The problem is that the real estate sector is something like 17% of it. That is, if that chunk of the economy collapses, you all of a sudden have 100 million or so people out of work, people out of their homes, rusting old infrastructure, and a massive, massive debt burden that China can't absorb without fucking its currency. So the worry is contagion within that market, which is so large and potentially spreading beyond that. You got to understand, if the investors in other countries get nervous about China because their real estate sector begins to backslide, and with Evergrande and several other companies having this similar problem, this could happen. It could spread, and investors could withdraw from China in general, collapsing the whole economy. Now, would this be painful for other people in the world? Yeah, I mean, if the Chinese economy really falters, I don't mean a little bit of a slowdown or a backslide, I mean like a depression era sort of thing. The United States would have problems because all the industry would shut down. We'd have to get all of the cheap goods made elsewhere, probably for a bit more expense, which would raise our prices, make trade more difficult. It would ripple across the whole world's economy. At this point, though, with China being hyper-aggressive and imperialistic, with them using the fact that you've got so many U.S. investments and Western investments there to try to pressure corporations in other countries to spread wokeness and to indoctrinate people and to fuck around. Considering that, yeah, it's probably best that they collapse. Hopefully that happens. Now, first and foremost, keep in mind if you're watching this video on YouTube, there will be a pinned comment down below with links to several other video hosting sites that I use. Keep in mind I make several exclusive videos every day on those platforms. They don't end up going on YouTube. Today, by the way, I have no literary update, so there will be 2 exclusive videos. This is like watching Winnie the Pooh sitting in the waiting room of a honey factory, fidgeting around and attempting not to haul off and jump in and fucking die of diabetes. China has to be massively, massively uncomfortable with this. This is hundreds of billions of dollars of debt we're talking about. The total within just their real estate sector of debt that's held, and this isn't government, this is developers, is in the multi-trillion-dollar range. Just from one slice of the economy, I would say small slice, but again, it's like 15, 17%. The amount of debt that China holds between the state and these various companies is actually in excess, speaking on size of economy, excess of that of the United States by a considerable margin. When we look at the problems that we have in the United States, effectively China's got all of them on steroids, including the wokeness and stuff. China promotes that. I think all the Sinophiles out there that are banking on China to rule the century and all that horse shit, they're going to be feeling very, very let down, especially when people throw China under the bus after it almost inevitably does have its great backslide. I think it's going to be similar to Japan, in the sense that Japan had the same thing going on in the 80s. Well, they're going to supplant the United States, everyone says. Their economy is swiftly growing. They're the number 2 economy, and they're poised to overtake us. And it never happened. Japan hit its limit. And Japan had an advantage. That is a lot of resources and technology. China still has to import a lot of the resources for its base industry, like manufacturing. The rare earth minerals, there's not enough, a huge amount in China, but there's not enough to even fucking supply it. They have to get a bunch for North Korea, too. China's also in a more diplomatically tenuous situation where the Eastern Bloc simply doesn't have the same kind of economic scope that the West Bloc does. I love when people show me that chart and says, well, here's a list of the top trading partners, U.S. versus China, in the world, and what was it, 2010, now here it is in 2020, and China appears to have massively expanded its trade supremacy, had 2/3 of the world trade more with China than the U.S., oh my god. When you actually look at that map, though, you're looking at a lot of countries that China is now buying from. To be clear, that does not fix for import and export, and so it's completely misleading and goddamn useless. By the way, there's a huge amount of actually fear porn about China. Literally hyperbolic propaganda about China, but it never focuses on the right things. It doesn't focus on them exporting critical race theory or attempting to influence Silicon Valley or spying on everyone else in the world or warmongering after Taiwan or its suppressive state policies or its ass-backwards facade economy. It's never about the corruption there or that Me Too tennis star that can't be named, I'm sure, on Chinese internet. It's never about these things. It's about China's going to supplant us. Wow, they've got 2 aircraft carriers now. We'd better watch out. It's Japan all over again without the technological nature of Japan, without the hyper-industrialization. A lot of China still lives in rural boony areas farming rice. That's like 2/3 of China. A large chunk of China is non-arable. That is the edge of the Gobi Desert, mountains in the south, etc. Some of the steppe in Tibet. You can have some farming there, but it's not the most hospitable landscape. Great for tourism, if tourists wanted to go to Tibet. See the Dalai Lama. Oh wait, no you can't. He doesn't enter China. Then you have a large chunk of it that is still just small villages with huge amounts of agriculture. And it's not efficient agriculture, to be clear. China has a huge amount of arable land potentially, but can't even feed itself. It imports U.S. food. They import half their fucking grain. They can't get enough of Texan pork. And then the United States, of course, caused economic problems in China with the lockdowns. Strange irony of the situation. Now, Evergrande defaulting, I think, is just the first step. And something that technically started years ago. You'll remember there were huge 4chan parties on politically incorrect about this. When China's economy was causing contagion in other Asian markets, and spread further than that too. Their stock market was tumbling. It lost a huge proportion of its value. China managed to stymie the situation, but they had to pump an enormous amount of money into the economy to keep it going, creating huge amounts of debt. Essentially speculating, by the way, in some cases on people's pensions. Because the Chinese stock market isn't the same as the U.S. market. In the U.S. market, who are the primary sources of the investment that goes on? The smart money, the one percenters. In China, the average person has investments in the stock market. Well, they do generally in collective funds and shit like that. They're not, the farmer dude, 60-year-old farmer out in his bamboo shack is obviously not on his smartphone checking his investments into the latest oil company or something like that. But the funds, in some cases, are coming from, billion people. And the Chinese government effectively rendered that half worthless and is still speculating now. That's because they have a fundamental problem. China's entire model is based on transforming China into a fully...
Es geht durch die Welt ein Geflüster. Arbeiter, hörst du es nicht? Das sind die Stimmen der Kriegsminister. Arbeiter, hörst du sie nicht? Es flüstern die Kohle- und Stahlproduzenten. Es flüstert die chemische Kriegsproduktion. Es flüstert von allen Kontinenten. Mobilmachung gegen die Sowjetunion. Arbeiter wollen den Krieg gewähren, den Krieg gewähren zur Hand. Zerschlag die faschistische Räuberheere, setzt alle Herzen in Brand. Lasst eure Noten wandern der Arbeit auf die Gedanken, auf jede Fabrik. Dann steigt aus den Trümmern der alten Gesellschaft die sozialistische Weltrepublik. Dann steigt aus den Trümmern der alten Gesellschaft die sozialistische Weltrepublik. Arbeiter, horch, sie ziehen ins Feld und schreien für Nation und Rasse. Das ist der Krieg der Herrscher der Welt gegen die Arbeiterklasse. Der Angriff gegen die Sowjetunion ist der Stoß ins Herz der Revolution. Und der Krieg, der jetzt durch die Länder geht, ist der Krieg gegen dich. Es geht durch die Welt ein Geflüster. Arbeiter, hörst du es nicht? Das sind die Stimmen der Kriegsminister. Arbeiter, hörst du sie nicht? Es flüstern die Es geht durch die Welt ein Geflüster. Arbeiter, hörst du es nicht? Das sind die Stimmen der Kriegsminister. Arbeiter, hörst du sie nicht? Es flüstern die Kohle- und Stahlproduzenten. Es flüstert die chemische Kriegsproduktion. Es flüstert von allen Kontinenten. Mobilmachung gegen die Sowjetunion. Arbeiter wollen den Krieg gewähren, den Krieg gewähren zur Hand. Zerschlag die faschistische Räuberheere, setzt alle Herzen in Brand. Lasst eure Noten wandern der Arbeit auf die Gedanken, auf jede Fabrik. Dann steigt aus den Trümmern der alten Gesellschaft die sozialistische Weltrepublik. Dann steigt aus den Trümmern der alten Gesellschaft die sozialistische Weltrepublik. Arbeiter, horch, sie ziehen ins Feld und schreien für Nation und Rasse. Das ist der Krieg der Herrscher der Welt gegen die Arbeiterklasse. Der Angriff gegen die Sowjetunion ist der Stoß ins Herz der Revolution. Und der Krieg, der jetzt durch die Länder geht, ist der Krieg gegen dich, Prolet! Arbeiter, Bauern, nehmt die Gewehre, zur Hand. Zerschlagt die faschistischen Räuberheere, setzt alle Herzen in Brand. Pflanzt eure roten Fahnen der Arbeit auf jede Lampe, auf jede Fabrik. Dann steigt aus den Trümmern der alten Gesellschaft die sozialistische Weltrepublik. Dann steigt aus den Trümmern der alten Gesellschaft die sozialistische Weltrepublik.
In the grand narrative of the Cold War, Australia doesn't often get too much.
Es geht durch die Welt ein Geflüster. Arbeiter, hörst du es nicht? Das sind die Stimmen der Kriegsminister. Arbeiter, hörst du sie nicht? Es flüstern die Kohle- und Stahlproduzenten. Es flüstert die chemische Kriegsproduktion. Es flüstert von allen Kontinenten. Mobilmachung gegen die Sowjetunion. Arbeiter, Bauern, nehmt die Gewehre zur Hand. Zerschlagt die faschistischen Räuberheere, setzt alle Herzen in Brand. Pflanzt eure roten Fahnen der Arbeit auf jede Lampe, auf jede Fabrik. Dann steigt aus den Trümmern der alten Gesellschaft die sozialistische Weltrepublik. Dann steigt aus den Trümmern der alten Gesellschaft die sozialistische Weltrepublik. Arbeiter, horch, sie ziehen ins Feld und schreien für Nation und Rasse. Das ist der Krieg der Herrscher der Welt gegen die Arbeiterklasse. Der Angriff gegen die Sowjetunion ist der Stoß ins Herz der Revolution. Und der Krieg, der jetzt durch die Länder geht, ist der Krieg gegen dich, Prolet! Arbeiter, Bauern, nehmt die Gewehre zur Hand. Zerschlagt die faschistischen Räuberheere, setzt alle Herzen in Brand. Pflanzt eure roten Fahnen der Arbeit auf jede Lampe, auf jede Fabrik. Dann steigt aus den Trümmern der alten Gesellschaft die sozialistische Weltrepublik. Dann steigt aus den Trümmern der alten Gesellschaft die sozialistische Weltrepublik.
In the grand narrative of the Cold War, Australia doesn't often get too much attention. However, this is rather unfair, as Australia was an integral part of the alliance system of the West and was actively involved in some of the bloodiest military actions of the conflict. From participation in the Cold War and then the Malay Emergency to combat duties during the American War in Vietnam, the Australian military was an active participant in the Western plans to prevent communism's spread across Asia. Canberra's membership in ANZUS, the Australia-New Zealand-United States Treaty, was meant to draw a line in the sand that Oceania and Southeast Asia would remain in the Western sphere of influence. So, all this to say, Australia did play a significant role during the Cold War, but the Cold War also played a significant role in Australia. What we're going to talk about today is a 1954 espionage case that actually collapsed a political party and solidified the Australian Liberal Party's control over the nation for over a decade. I'm your host David, and today we are looking at the 1954 Petrov Affair. This is the Cold War. Allow us to present the sponsor of today's video, WREN, a public benefit company started in 2019 with a mission to unlock the collective action of individuals against climate change. Although it is the big players who are most guilty in climate change, each and every one of us has a carbon footprint, and Ren is here to help with auxiliaries. While there was little direct military threat possible by the Soviets against Australia, Moscow did choose to use one of its favorite strategic tools, the establishment of spy networks, to not only gather information, but to recruit agents in positions of power and influence. As in other countries, the Soviets used their embassy in Canberra to begin the work of establishing a network of recruits. To this end, Vladimir and Yevdokia Petrov were selected by the MGB to be posted to the Soviet embassy in Canberra. Vladimir, whose real name was Afanasy Shorokov, was born in 1907 to a poor peasant family in central Siberia. Having served in the Navy as a cipher clerk, by the 1930s he had joined the NKVD as a cipher expert. He managed to avoid the purges and even spent time as a cipher clerk in China in the late 1930s. Yevdokia was born in Ryazan, near Moscow, in 1914, and both her father and her first husband had served in the NKVD, although both were arrested in 1937 and sent into exile. She married Vladimir in 1940 as a safe option. Because of the family arrests, she was under suspicion, but Vladimir was deemed safe. This became especially necessary for her in 1943, when her brother was also arrested. By 1950, Yevdokia herself had been recruited into the MGB and was working as a cipher specialist like her husband. In 1951, Vladimir and Yevdokia were assigned as diplomats to the Soviet embassy in Canberra. While Yevdokia held the rank of captain in the MGB, Vladimir was a lieutenant colonel and reported directly to Moscow, bypassing all of the diplomatic staff at the embassy. His duties were to maintain contact with already recruited Soviet agents in the country, as well as find new recruits in order to create a larger and more effective information gathering network. Specifically, he was targeting Australians who would be able to provide inside information regarding Australian foreign policy. Provided with a list of potential recruits, it was his job to learn everything he could about them, recognize their faces, know their social background, where they worked, their religious practices, as well as both their financial and family positions, and most importantly, how they felt about the Soviet Union. Any or all of this information could then be used to try and recruit people into working with Petrov and the MGB. In addition to recruiting Australians, he was also tasked with infiltrating the Russian emigre community, largely composed of anti-communists, it should be noted, to either recruit them or persuade them to return to the USSR. This last task would have been an uphill battle for any agent. Yevdokia's job at the embassy was to cipher, encode and decode all the traffic passing back and forth between Vladimir and Moscow. The Petrovs' relationship with the embassy staff was strained, however, with the senior members at the embassy being quite unhappy with the work Vladimir and Yevdokia were doing. They even went so far as to send letters back to Moscow with official complaints about their lack of success. Of course, these complaints all had merit. Vladimir had found it very difficult to recruit new agents and build a network as he had been tasked. There are even reports that Vladimir had contemplated defection while in conversation with Yevdokia, surely a sign he was worried about his position and safety. Vladimir had no direct family back in the Soviet Union, meaning defection posed no risk to those around him. Yevdokia, on the other hand, did have family, and her concerns over their security meant she would not consider defection. And then 1953 happened. The shock of Stalin's death was one thing for the Petrovs, but the arrest of Beria was another matter altogether. Beria had maintained control over the security services by ensuring that those in positions of influence were his people. Almost immediately after his arrest, however, a campaign began against both Beria's legacy as well as his subordinates. In Canberra, the embassy staff began reporting back to Moscow that Vladimir was a Beria man and that he had been trying to establish a pro-Beria circle in the embassy. Vladimir knew this could be enough to not only force his recall to Moscow, but it would likely lead to his being purged. It was time for him to take action. Instead of destroying the secret documents he handled at the embassy, he began to keep them, storing them at his house. Vladimir also confided his intentions with a friend he had made since moving to Canberra, a Polish emigre, the violinist Michael Białogórski. Vladimir had been working Białogórski to try and get information and further contacts in the emigre community, but unknown to Vladimir, Białogórski was himself working with the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, ASIO, and had spent the time of their friendship working Petrov. During the time they had spent together at the Russian Social Club in Sydney and in the brothels of King's Cross, a genuine friendship had formed. Vladimir made the decision that he would defect. He also made this decision without telling his wife. With his decision made, Petrov began negotiations with ASIO over the terms of his defection, including provisions of asylum and protection in exchange for the secret documents he was hiding. ASIO Deputy Director Ron Richards was put in charge of the operation, codenamed Operation Cabin 12. On the 3rd of April 1954, Petrov committed himself and defected, handing over secret documents dated from 1951 and 1952. He was immediately taken to a safe house in Sydney's North Shore. What Petrov turned over consisted of 176 documents containing lists of people in Australia working for the Soviet Union, analysis of Japanese interests in Australia, coverage of US attitudes towards Australia, as well as general information on political events, as well as letters and orders from Moscow to the embassy. On the 13th of April, the Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies informed Parliament of the defection of Vladimir Petrov and called for a royal commission to investigate and report on the extent of Soviet espionage in Australia. This call by the PM was being made about a month before a general election in which the Australian Labor Party was expected to do well against the Menzies Liberal Country Coalition. I'm introducing that here in order to maintain chronology, but just keep this Royal Commission in mind as we're going to circle back to this in a minute. Now, what about Vladimir's wife, Yevdokia? Well, she had been placed under house arrest in the Soviet embassy in Canberra. The KGB, the MGB had been reformed into the KGB in March, you'll remember from our video on just that, had dispatched 2 couriers to escort Yevdokia back to Moscow. She knew that she likely faced severe consequences and hardships upon her return to the Rodina. While she knew she could still try to defect, she continued to worry about the repercussions to her family in the Soviet Union. On April 20, Yevdokia was transported to Mascot, that's Sydney's airport, to begin her journey back home. Anti-communist protesters had gathered at the airport and even tried to pull her away from her KGB escorts. It was at this point that one of the more famous pictures of the entire affair was taken, with Yevdokia being dragged across the tarmac by KGB representatives. She boarded the aircraft and it left Sydney. But this was still the earlier days of air travel, and the plane needed to land in Darwin at the northern tip of the Northern Territory in order to refuel. ASIO, still wanting to assist if possible, managed to get in contact with the pilot while in flight, and subsequently with Yevdokia herself. It was at this time that Vladimir also spoke with Yevdokia, convincing her to request asylum and defect once the plane landed in Darwin. The Soviet reaction to the defection of both of the Petrovs was swift and decisive. Leveling accusations of financial theft against the couple, Moscow demanded the Petrovs to be handed over to Soviet authorities, a demand Australia refused. On April 23rd, only 3 days after Yevdokia's defection, the Soviet Union broke off diplomatic relations with Canberra. All Soviet embassy staff in the country were recalled, and Australian diplomats in the Soviet Union were expelled. Diplomatic relations between the countries would not be re-established until 1959. The Petrovs would spend the rest of their lives living quiet, hidden lives under assumed names in a suburb of Melbourne. Vladimir died in 1991, while Yevdokia passed away in 2002. And that concludes our episode on the Petrov affair. But it doesn't, because this spy story had a profound effect